The month started with unusually mild weather for northern Wisconsin. It was late January, and I'd been preparing for a short winter camping trip for a while. Here, when the temperature edges into the 30s, the snow begins to melt, leaving everything soggy and icy, which can quickly turn a fun outing into a miserable one. If I was going to do this, I needed to act soon. I mentioned my plan to my buddy Sam. He'd never tried winter camping, but after hearing me talk about it for years, he seemed intrigued. At first, I figured he'd bail, but when I brought up the forecast, a low of -8 degrees Fahrenheit on the night we'd be out, his interest only grew. Sam was always game for a challenge. Despite my own hesitation about camping in such frigid conditions, I agreed. It would be a new adventure for him and an opportunity for me to test my equipment in tougher weather. The spot I had in mind was a secluded area near Bear Lake, a little north of the town of Ashland. It was remote enough to feel isolated, surrounded by a dense mix of pines and birch trees, with a small frozen lake nearby. The silence there had an eerie quality, the kind of place that makes you feel like the only person on Earth. I'd been there before, though only during the warmer seasons. This time, with the thick snow already blanketing the ground, I knew it would push our endurance and our gear to the limit. When we reached the trailhead, the thermometer read about 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. A sharp wind cut through the air, biting at any exposed skin and making it hard to breathe. Each breath formed clouds in the air, and the trees around us groaned under the weight of heavy snow. Aside from us, the place was completely deserted. Sam's excitement was clear, maybe a bit too clear. He seemed eager, bordering on restless, as he fumbled with his layers and gear. Meanwhile, I got straight to work, pulling out the essentials. A pair of backpacking stoves, one fueled by gas and the other by alcohol, along with extreme cold-rated sleeping bags, pads, and enough survival supplies to ensure we'd be safe if things didn't go as planned. Though I was confident in my abilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would push me in unexpected ways. We set off down the trail, snow crunching under our boots and the wind stinging our faces. The path was faintly marked with faded yellow blazes on the trees, barely visible in the dim light. Each step was a struggle as we sank into the packed snow, which felt dense and heavy underfoot. After trudging for what felt like hours, we found a small clearing near the lake and decided to set up camp. The spot offered a bit of shelter from the wind, and the frozen lake stretched out before us like a vast white desert. Despite the peaceful setting, something about the atmosphere felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it left me uneasy. Setting up camp in the biting cold was a challenge. The tent poles were icy to the touch, and the fabric felt stiff, making it hard to work efficiently. By the time we finished, my fingers were numb, and I was starting to feel the weight of the freezing air. Lighting the stove proved difficult, too. The gas wouldn't ignite until I warmed the lighter in my pocket, and even then, the alcohol stove burned sluggishly. Meanwhile, Sam was trying to start a fire with damp wood he'd gathered, his frustration evident as he struggled to get it going. Eventually, we managed to get some warmth from the fire, but it had taken so long that the cold had seeped deep into my bones. That night, the sleeping bags kept us from freezing entirely, but they didn't offer much comfort. The cold was relentless, pressing in from every direction, making it nearly impossible to relax. The wind outside howled like a living thing, rattling the tent and creaking the snow-laden trees. Around midnight, I woke abruptly. Something wasn't right. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. The faint crunch of snow, deliberate and steady. My pulse quickened. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too controlled, too human. Someone or something was out there moving around our campsite. I stayed silent, straining to hear over the sound of the wind. The footsteps paused, then resumed, circling the tents. My chest tightened with fear. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was just the wind or another camper. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence settled over the camp. I held my breath, listening, waiting, but there was nothing. The stillness was almost worse than the sound. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, keeping my eyes locked on the tent's entrance and gripping my flashlight tightly. The first light, I wasted no time. I packed up quickly and woke Sam, who seemed blissfully unaware of what had transpired. I didn't explain much, just said we needed to leave. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling, the cold gnawing at our faces, but I was too focused on getting out to care. Even as we reached the truck and left the woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Whatever or whoever had been out there wasn't gone. And as much as I'd loved that spot before, I knew I wouldn't be returning. Even now, the memory of that night lingers, leaving me unsettled every time I think about it. I'll never forget the camping trip that taught me how unsettling a quiet forest could be. It wasn't my first time camping, and it wouldn't be my last, but those nights left a lasting impression I can't shake. It was mid-July and the weather was ideal, warm days and cool, clear nights. I had picked a location in eastern Minnesota, a place known as Willow Glen. It was part of a large state forest with winding trails, dense trees, and a small, reflective lake at its heart. I'd visited before, but this trip was meant to be a chance to unplug and enjoy some time alone. I arrived early on a Wednesday morning, aiming to claim a good spot before the weekend rush. The site I chose was secluded, tucked away from the main trail and shaded by towering pines and birches. It felt remote but wasn't entirely cut off. I could faintly hear distant voices or the hum of a faraway radio. My tent was set up near the edge of a clearing, giving me a great view of the woods. The first day went smoothly. I spent most of it hiking along trails, pausing occasionally to photograph blooming wildflowers or watch chipmunks darting about. By the time I returned, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled in with a paperback. The crackling fire and gentle rustling of leaves were the only sounds around me. It was tranquil, the kind of peace I had come for. That first night, something startling happened. I was half asleep when an enormous crash jolted me awake. It sounded like an explosion, and my heart raced as I lay frozen. When I finally unzipped my tent and peered outside, I saw a massive tree had toppled just a few yards from my tent. Its trunk, thick as a barrel, had snapped near the base, and its branches sprawled across the ground like broken limbs. There had been no wind, no storm, nothing to explain it. I stared at it, my flashlight reflecting off the splintered wood. Eventually, I told myself it must have been natural. Perhaps the tree was weakened or hollow. But I couldn't shake the uneasy thought of how close it had been. If my tent had been a little further into the clearing, I might have been crushed. The next morning, I moved my tent to the middle of the clearing, away from the surrounding trees. It wasn't an ideal spot, but it felt safer. I spent the day hiking again and fishing by the lake, but every gust of wind made me glance nervously at the treetops. By evening, other campers began arriving. A family with young kids set up a few sites down, and a middle-aged man parked his truck and pitched a small tent nearby. It was reassuring to have others around, even though I didn't interact with them. Just knowing I wasn't completely alone brought some comfort. That night, the second tree fell. I was awake this time, roasting marshmallows over my fire, when another deafening crash shattered the stillness. I jumped up, spinning toward the sound, and saw another large tree had fallen, this time across the path to the lake. The family nearby came out with flashlights, their beams flickering over the fallen trunk. They didn't seem overly worried, but I felt the coincidence was too strong. 2 massive trees had fallen in less than a day. Sleep didn't come easily that night, Every creak and groan of the forest felt ominous, like the woods themselves were alive. The third tree fell the next afternoon. I was returning from the lake when I heard it. This time, it narrowly missed the camper with the truck. By the time I reached the site, a small group had gathered. The tree had crushed his tent but missed him. He'd been napping in his truck. Someone with a chainsaw helped clear the wreckage, but the mood had shifted. By sunset, most of the campers had packed up and left. I stayed, though I can't explain why. Perhaps it was denial or a stubborn belief that nothing else would happen. That night, as I lay in my tent, I listened to the overwhelming silence, every sound amplified by my nerves. At some point, I heard a faint groan, like the forest itself was straining. Then came a sharp crack, followed by the ground shaking. I scrambled out of my tent with my flashlight, shaking so hard I could barely hold it steady. Another tree had fallen, its branches brushing against my tent as it crashed to the ground. That was the final straw. I threw my gear into my car, my hands trembling, and drove away without looking back. I haven't returned to Willow Glen since. I still go camping, but every time I pitch my tent, I can't help but glance nervously at the trees, wondering which one might come down next. My partner Mike and I decided to go on a camping trip to try something new, somewhere peaceful to take a break from our hectic schedules. It was early October last year when we found a small, private campsite in northeastern Minnesota, not far from Lake Superior. It wasn't part of a large park or campground, but owned by a kind woman named Karen. She had listed it online, and what caught our attention was the shed with a bathroom and electrical outlets. For someone like me, who wasn't thrilled about the idea of digging a hole for bathroom needs, it seemed like the perfect spot. We arrived on a cool Friday afternoon. The leaves were just beginning to turn vibrant shades of red and orange, and the crisp air smelled of earth and pine. Karen greeted us warmly as we pulled into the gravel driveway. Her property was stunning, bordered by dense woods on three sides, with the faint sound of waves from the lake in the distance. The campsite was nestled in a clearing not far from her house, providing privacy but still within a comfortable distance. There was a picnic table, a fire pit, and the small shed she had mentioned, about 20 feet from where we pitched our tent. As we unpacked and set up our gear, Karen chatted with us about the area. She mentioned nearby hiking trails and advised us to keep food secured to avoid attracting wildlife. She also brought up something odd. Something had been raiding her bird feed recently. She suspected raccoons or maybe a large squirrel, but hadn't caught the culprit yet. She gestured to a sturdy metal bin near her shed filled with birdseed and corn. "It's heavy," she said. "So whatever's tipping it over must be strong." I didn't think much of it at the time and chalked it up to usual forest critters. That evening, Mike and I made a small fire, roasted marshmallows, and soaked in the serenity of the woods. The occasional rustle of leaves and distant hoots of an owl were the only sounds breaking the quiet. By the time we settled into the tent on our air mattress, I felt utterly relaxed, the pressures of everyday life feeling far away. Sometime during the night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. The air inside the tent was damp and chilly. Grabbing my flashlight, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The stillness hit me immediately. No crickets chirping, no wind in the trees, just an eerie silence that made the hair on my neck stand up. I shook it off, assuming it was normal for the time of night, and hurried to the shed, my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Once inside, I finished quickly and made my way back. The oppressive silence lingered, but I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Back in the tent, I snuggled into the mattress, trying to drift back to sleep, but something kept nagging at me, the unnatural stillness. Not even insects were buzzing. Just as I was about to doze off, a sound jolted me awake. A deep, guttural growl followed by frantic, high-pitched yelps. It was the unmistakable noise of a predator attacking prey. The growling was so intense I felt it rumble through the ground, and the yelping ended abruptly, replaced by thrashing and dragging noises. My stomach turned. I lay frozen, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent. Mike remained asleep beside me, his breathing calm and oblivious. I focused on his steady breaths to keep from panicking. Whatever was out there was big and dangerously close. The noise stopped, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. I strained to hear any movement, but the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Then, faint but distinct, I heard its soft, crunching footsteps circling the tent. Each deliberate step pressed heavily into the ground. I held my breath, clutching Mike's arm, willing him to wake up. The footsteps paused, then shifted toward the shed. Scraping sounds followed, and the loud clang of the metal being overturned echoed through the night. For several minutes, I listened to crunching and shuffling, my imagination running wild about what kind of creature could cause such noise. Eventually, the sounds subsided. I lay awake, tense, until the first hints of dawn illuminated the tent. Mike stirred, and I recounted the night's events. He was skeptical but didn't dismiss me entirely. When we stepped outside, the evidence was undeniable. The heavy bin had been knocked over, birdseed and corn scattered everywhere. Deep gouges marked the ground and the shed's wooden siding. Whatever had been there wasn't just big, it was powerful. We packed up quickly, leaving a note for Karen to thank her for hosting us. As we drove away, a chill lingered in my chest. Whether it was a bear, a wolf, or something else entirely, one thing was certain: we wouldn't be camping there again. Even now, the memory haunts me. Every time I hear a deep growl or leaves rustling outside, I'm reminded of that night. The terror of knowing something was out there, and we were utterly at its mercy. Dark soul and glowing eyes. Before I start, let me paint a picture. During the events of this tale, I was staying at a small house, more like a cabin, somewhere in northern Michigan. It was part of a collection of 10 such houses, all arranged in a semicircle around a playground. At the time, I was 10 years old, and my older brother and I had befriended a slightly older kid, maybe 15, named Kyle. Kyle was peculiar, the kind of kid who seemed to be a constant letdown to his parents. I never met them, but he often ignored their calls, even late at night. Being young, I couldn't understand why anyone would avoid their parents, but that might be because I was a bit of a goody-goody back then. Truthfully, I didn't like Kyle much, but my brother did, and since I idolized my brother, I followed along wherever he went. Unfortunately, my brother felt the same way about Kyle, which meant I was stuck with him. One evening, Kyle got the idea to sneak out. Naturally, my brother wanted to join, and since we shared a room, I was roped in too. At first, we just hung out at the playground, but boredom set in quickly. I suggested we call it a night, but the older boys overruled me. Kyle proposed exploring the nearby woods, and despite my protests, I had no choice but to tag along. The forest wasn't dense, and you could faintly hear cars from the highway a couple of miles away. Using the weak light from Kyle's phone, we wandered aimlessly. After a short while, I wanted to turn back, but faced two unappealing choices: walk back alone in the dark or stick with them. Reluctantly, I stayed. As we ventured deeper, the woods grew eerily quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. I mentioned it, and we all paused to listen. My brother, annoyed, snapped, "Stop making noise. I'm trying to hear." "I'm not doing anything," I retorted. "That heavy breathing? Knock it off," he shot back. Confused and about to protest again, I froze as I heard it too. A deep, labored breathing. "That's not me," I whispered. Kyle and my brother exchanged uneasy glances. The breathing grew louder, almost eager. Then, simultaneously, we all looked up. Above us were two glowing orbs, shining a cold, pale blue and swaying slightly. We stared, transfixed, until a bone-chilling groan shattered the silence. It sounded like a smoker trying to scream while gasping for air. The spell broke and we bolted. Behind us, we heard branches snapping and trees shaking violently. Whatever it was in the trees. I wasn't a fast runner, and my legs began to burn almost immediately. My brother and Kyle pulled ahead, leaving me behind. Desperate, I dove into a bush, hoping to hide. Fate wasn't on my side. It was a thorn bush. Pain shot through me as I was covered in cuts and scratches. I bit my lip to stifle a cry. From my hiding spot, I heard a heavy thud as something landed nearby. Peeking through the thorns, I saw the glowing orbs again. They weren't lights, they were eyes. The creature they belonged to stepped into the clearing. It was straight out of a nightmare, standing about 7 feet tall. Its skin was a sickly gray and stretched unnaturally tight over its gaunt frame, outlining its ribs and stomach. Its arms were long, ending in sharp claws. But the most horrifying part was its chest. Where a sternum should have been was an open cavity, the ribs bent outward. In the hollow space sat a pulsating black mass, beating like a grotesque heart. Its face was obscured by the brightness of its eyes, but I could hear its raspy breathing. It stood there, scanning the area. Time felt frozen as I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, it finally moved on. I stayed in that thorn bush until the first rays of sunlight pierced the sky. Ignoring the pain in my legs and the blood dripping from my wounds, I stumbled out of the forest. After what seemed like an eternity of running, I found myself on the edge of a busy highway. As I staggered onto the road, everything went black. When I woke, I was in a hospital. A passing driver had spotted me and called for help. My parents were there, worried sick. I told them everything, but they dismissed it as the wild imagination of a scared kid. My brother had returned to the cabin hours earlier and only mentioned me missing the next morning. A search party had been organized just before they got the call about my whereabouts. It's been nearly 8 years since that night. I've scoured the internet, desperate to identify the creature I saw, but nothing matches. If anyone knows what it could be, I'd be grateful for any answers. It tried to lead me away from an unknown author. My family and I were on vacation in Kentucky for my parents' anniversary. I was about 8 years old at the time. We'd rented a small cabin near the forest, and one afternoon, my dad and I went down to the river close to the cabin. My dad was busy preparing a canoe at the dock. While he worked, I spotted a deer near the edge of the woods. Being a curious and animal-loving kid, I couldn't resist following it. I wandered into the forest, trying to get closer to the deer. Before long, I found myself in a darker, denser part of the woods. That's when I felt it, a prickling sensation like something was watching me. I'd felt this way before, and usually I wasn't wrong. I turned around and saw the deer standing not far behind me. It was staring straight at me, but something was off. Its eyes didn't look like an animal's. They resembled human eyes, but they glowed a faint red. That image burned itself into my memory. As I stared, I noticed its neck, which seemed oddly attached to its body, like its head had been sewn back on. I moved slowly, trying to circle around the creature without breaking eye contact, heading toward the clearing where my dad was. The tension was unbearable. I didn't know what might happen if I looked away. To ease my nerves, I tried speaking to it. "I won't hurt you," I said in a shaky voice. I hoped the sound of my words would make me feel braver. Then something terrifying happened. The deer's expression changed. It looked like it was smiling. The smile revealed teeth that were unnervingly straight and square, like a person's teeth. And then it spoke. "But what if I hurt you?" The voice was calm, but every hair on my body stood on end. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I was frozen in fear. Then I heard my dad's voice shouting my name. I turned to see him sprinting toward me. The deer must have heard him too, because when I turned back, it was gone. My dad reached me, looking worried, and asked why I'd wandered so far. He reminded me I should have stayed close to him. I told him I'd followed a deer and described what I saw, its human-like eyes, its unsettling smile. My dad's expression darkened. He grabbed my hand and told me firmly to come back to the canoe with him. We spent the rest of the day on the water, and for a while I was able to forget about what had happened. It wasn't until we got off the canoe and I was removing my life jacket that I saw it again. The same deer was standing at the edge of the woods. This time, it was upright on its hind legs, and its jaw hung loosely, dripping with blood. I screamed, and the thing turned and ran deeper into the trees, but not like a normal deer. It moved like a person, stumbling on two legs with a limp. My dad spun around, startled, and asked what was wrong. All I could do was point toward the forest, where I saw a figure draped in what looked like a deer's hide disappearing into the darkness. I refused to go outside for the rest of the trip. Years later, I remembered that night and decided to research the area where we'd stayed. I learned it had once been land sacred to a Native American tribe. That's when I read about skinwalkers, and the pieces started to come together. Even now, I can't be sure what I saw that night. All I know is that it wasn't a normal deer. The experience has stayed with me. To this day, I get anxious whenever I see a deer on the side of the road or in a field. I've never gone hunting with my dad, even though he's asked many times. I feel bad saying no, but the thought of going back into the woods fills me with dread. Sometimes, I wish I had never followed that thing into the forest. Terror in the cabin from Cedar Creek. During my high school years, I attended a particular summer camp one year where I met a girl I'll call Rachel. She was tough, self-assured, and a bit edgy, but I admired her confidence. We shared a cabin that summer with a mutual friend. I later learned that Rachel had a deep fear of the dark and always kept a light on in her bedroom at home. One evening, there was a massive storm accompanied by a tornado warning. We hurried back to our cabins from the dining hall, running through relentless rain and howling winds. I'd never experienced wind so powerful. It felt as if it could lift me off my feet. After everyone settled in for the night, the storm continued raging outside. Sometime during the night, we were jolted awake by sobbing and the lights unexpectedly going out. The sound of the storm heightened my own fear. I suddenly became anxious about my family's safety, worried they might be caught in the same dangerous weather. The light in our cabin stayed on for the rest of the night after that. The next morning, Rachel recounted what had happened. She said she had been trying to sleep when she saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. Its head nearly reached the ceiling, and it was entirely black, except for two glowing red eyes. Even now, the thought of it makes my skin crawl. Rachel also described seeing two distorted versions of our camp counselors. One, a small girl with extremely long hair, appeared lifeless, hanging on the bunk opposite hers. The other counselor had two grinning heads. The real counselors came into the cabin, sang to Rachel to calm her down, and turned the lights back on. At that age, the experience deeply unsettled me. I had never witnessed anything paranormal, nor had anyone I knew. Rachel wasn't one to lie or show weakness. For her to cry, something truly terrifying must have happened. To this day, I believe that what she saw in the corner was something malevolent, perhaps even the devil himself. Hashtag, 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 it sounded like my brother from Northern Pines. This took place at my family's cabin in southern Saskatchewan, Canada, during the summer of 2020. My family, except for my mom and me, was taking their afternoon naps. My mother was working in the fields, and I, feeling bored, decided to explore the woods on our property. We owned around 60 acres of land, most of which was forested. The day seemed ordinary until something happened that I'll never forget. As I strolled along an overgrown trail, a foul smell hit me, a combination of decay and mildew. Thinking an animal had died nearby, I stepped off the path to investigate. As I searched, I heard something strange. My baby brother's voice calling out to me from deeper in the woods. He was urging me to follow him. Panic set in. I thought he might have woken up and wandered into the forest alone. I hurried toward the voice, but as I got closer, around 15 meters away, I heard another noise. This time, it was the sound of something massive moving through the brush. It was far too big to be a toddler. The voice called out again, now much nearer. Overcome with fear, I turned and ran as fast as I could back toward the cabin. I didn't dare look back, terrified of tripping or slowing down. As I reached the edge of the woods, the noises stopped. I slowed my pace and walked the rest of the way across the field to the cabin. When I got inside, I found my baby brother still fast asleep in his bed, just as he had been when I left. That's when I realized that whatever had called to me in the woods wasn't human. For days after, I avoided the forest, afraid of encountering that presence again, or worse, being followed. I hope never to feel such terror again. Let this serve as a warning to anyone who loves the wilderness. Don't trust strange voices in the woods. We shared a cabin that year, along with another friend we both knew. It wasn't until later that I learned Sarah was afraid of the dark and always kept a lamp on in her room at home. One night, a violent storm rolled in, accompanied by warnings of a possible tornado. The winds howled and the rain poured as we hurried back to our cabin from the dining hall. The sheer force of the wind was incredible. It felt like it could sweep me off my feet. I'd never experienced anything like it before or since. That night, everyone went to sleep without incident, but sometime in the middle of the night, we were startled awake. Someone in the cabin was crying, and the lights had somehow been turned off. Hearing the storm still raging outside filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't help but fear for my family back home and wonder if they were safe. The lights stayed on for the rest of the night after that. The next morning, Sarah recounted what had happened. As she tried to fall asleep, she claimed she saw a shadowy figure in the corner of the room. It was enormous, its head brushing the ceiling. The figure was completely black, except for two glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. Just thinking about it still gives me chills. Sarah also described seeing two distorted versions of our counselors. One, a petite woman with long hair, appeared lifeless and strung up on the opposite bunk. The other had two grinning faces. The real counselors later tried to soothe her by singing and switching the lights back on. As a young teen, the incident left a lasting impression on me. I had never encountered anything remotely paranormal before, nor had anyone I knew. Sarah, usually grounded and tough, wasn't the type to make things up, let alone cry unless truly terrified. To this day, I believe Sarah saw something supernatural that night. She described what seemed to be demonic entities, and in the corner of the room, perhaps something even worse. ####, it sounded like my brother. This story took place at my family's cabin in southeastern Saskatchewan, Canada. It was the summer of 2020, and everyone in my family, except for my mom and me, was taking an afternoon nap. My mom was working outside, so I decided to kill time by exploring the woods on our property. We owned around 70 acres of land, most of it dense forest. That day was like any other, calm and uneventful, so I wasn't expecting anything unusual to happen. I strolled down a narrow trail overgrown with plants, enjoying the peace, when I suddenly caught a terrible smell. The odor was unbearable, like rotting flesh mixed with mildew. Thinking it might be a dead animal, I left the trail to investigate. As I moved deeper into the trees, I heard a familiar voice, my little brother's voice, calling out to me. He sounded distressed, asking me to follow him. Panic surged through me. I thought he must have woken up and wandered off, getting lost in the woods. I quickly headed toward the sound. About 30 feet away from where the voice had come from, I heard something else, a loud rustling in the brush. Whatever was making the noise was far too large to be a toddler. Then, the voice came again, this time much closer. Fear consumed me, and I turned and bolted back toward the cabin. I could hear something heavy crashing through the undergrowth behind me, but I didn't dare look back, afraid I'd trip or fall. As soon as I reached the edge of the woods, the noise stopped. I slowed to a walk and crossed the field to the cabin, heart pounding. When I got inside, I found my little brother sound asleep in his bed, exactly where he'd been when I left. That's when I realized what I'd encountered wasn't my brother at all. It wasn't human. For days after, I avoided going back into the forest, terrified I'd run into whatever it was, or that it would come looking for me. Let this serve as a warning to anyone who loves the outdoors. Don't trust strange voices in the woods. It had been pouring steadily all day, and the forecast promised it would only get worse as night fell. I had pitched my tent in a secluded clearing deep in the forest, far from any trails people usually traveled. The rhythm of the rain drumming against the tent was consistent, almost soothing, but tonight, it felt unsettling. The clearing was encircled by dense trees, their branches sagging under the weight of the downpour. I'd camped alone many times before, but this time, an unshakable feeling crept over me, as though I wasn't alone. It wasn't something I could see or hear, just an eerie sense that someone or something was watching. The unease prickled under my skin. Trying to dismiss it, I ate a quick, cold meal inside my tent and zipped myself snugly into my sleeping bag. Outside, the rain intensified, pounding the tent harder. The wind pushed through the trees, making them groan and creak. I tried convincing myself it was just the storm making me anxious. But then, over the noise of the rain, I caught a faint crunch, a sound like footsteps on soggy ground. It wasn't the random rustle of an animal or branches snapping in the wind. It was deliberate, slow, and measured, like someone walking. My heart raced as I froze in place. Who would be wandering out here in the middle of nowhere during a storm like this? The steps drew closer, each one dragging slightly, as if the person or thing was moving carefully, purposefully. I held my breath, staying as still as I could, listening intently. Then they stopped right outside my tent. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Whoever was out there didn't budge. The rain's persistent drumming almost masked the faint sound of slow, steady breathing. It wasn't shaky or hurried, but calm and deliberate, like someone waiting. I stared at the tent wall, half expecting to see a shadow pass or the zipper begin to slide open, but nothing happened. Eventually, the steps resumed, moving away this time. They grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. Still, I didn't feel safe. I didn't sleep. I sat clutching the small knife I always kept in my bag, my muscles aching from remaining so still. The rain fell relentlessly, its constant patter amplifying the eerie quiet outside. When dawn finally broke and the rain eased, I gathered the courage to unzip my tent and peer outside. The clearing looked just as it had the day before, except for one disturbing detail. Muddy footprints surrounded my tent. They looped around it again and again, as though someone had been pacing there for hours. My hands shook as I packed up my gear as quickly as possible. I wanted to leave immediately. Just as I was about to leave the clearing, something caught my eye. A small piece of fabric, tied neatly into a knot, hanging from a branch near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't mine. I grabbed my things and hurried back to my car, refusing to look back. It wasn't until I was driving away that I started to feel any semblance of safety. Still, the memory of that night haunted me. Those footprints, the strange fabric. When I got home, I searched online and discovered that hunters sometimes leave similar markers to note certain spots. But why someone would do that in the middle of the night, circling my tent, I still can't explain it. Once we were all packed up, my grandparents invited me to join them on a trip to a quiet campsite they'd loved for years. They described it as a peaceful, hidden retreat deep within a dense forest, far removed from civilization. Though I'd gone camping before, this place had a different aura even before we arrived. The drive was long, with paved roads giving way to gravel and then to dirt trails. My grandpa carefully steered the old truck down the bumpy path, making sure our camping gear and a small tent didn't jostle too much in the back. By the time we pulled into the clearing, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows among the tall trees. There were no cars, no people, just us and the wilderness. We set up camp in a little opening near a bubbling stream. My grandmother laid out some blankets and began preparing dinner while my grandfather pitched the tent. The chilly air carried only the sound of the stream's rush and the occasional rustling leaves. It was tranquil, but something about it felt strange, as if the forest were holding its breath. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside seemed amplified. The snap of twigs, the wind weaving through the branches, the steady murmur of the stream. At one point, I heard soft, deliberate steps, slow and heavy, crunching faintly against the earth. I reassured myself it must have been an animal, but the uneasy sensation of being watched stayed with me. The following day, we explored the area. My grandparents showed me the stream where they used to fish and a large moss-covered rock they said had been there as long as they could remember. In the daylight, the forest seemed less daunting, but the lingering feeling of being observed persisted. Though nothing unusual happened, I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't truly alone. As evening fell, the forest grew oppressive again, with deepening shadows and an unsettling quiet. My grandfather lit a fire, and we sat around it, eating and chatting about the day's adventures. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows across the trees, making them appear to move. My grandmother suggested turning in early, warning that the hike back to the truck the next day would be tough. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, and the tent was enveloped in darkness. First, everything was still. Then I heard it again. The footsteps, clearer and closer this time. They were unmistakably human. I froze, my heart hammering as the sounds approached the tent. My grandparents slept soundly, unaware. The steps grew louder, pausing right outside, then resumed, moving slowly as though circling the tent. My breath caught as a new sound joined the footsteps, a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt. The steps came full circle around the tent again. I wanted to scream, to wake my grandparents, but fear kept me paralyzed. The sounds eventually faded, and I stayed awake, too terrified to close my eyes until dawn. When daylight finally arrived, I bolted from the tent to check outside. The ground was marked with large, heavy footprints and a long, dragged trail leading from the tent into the woods. I showed my grandparents, who exchanged a tense glance. They didn't say much, but I could tell they were disturbed. Without explanation, we packed up hastily and left. My grandfather gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and my grandmother kept glancing nervously at the trees as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge. When we returned home, my grandparents never spoke of the trip again, and neither did I. But I noticed changes in their behavior. They installed new locks on all the doors and windows, heavier than any I'd seen before. They kept the curtains drawn at all hours, even during the day. Both of them seemed on edge, as if carrying a fear they refused to share. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, the deliberate, steady tread of someone circling our tent. I can't stop wondering who or what was out there with us in the forest. And more than that, I wonder why it felt like it never really left. The creepy cabin incident a few years back. My family used to rent cabins near a large lake with my grandparents during the summer. We'd usually grill food, swim, and take boats out on the lake for fishing and other fun activities. Over time, the place became a nice escape from my boring hometown. When we first got to this particular cabin, I have to admit, it looked a bit shady. The neighbors seemed odd. They left their pool as soon as we arrived and kept staring at us for a while. Skip to the second night, and my brother and I couldn't sleep. We decided to sneak out and hang out by this small pond to smoke. Unbeknownst to me, my brother had been taking painkillers and passed out after about 20 minutes of us being on our phones. I was a reckless teenager at the time, so I swiped what he had left and wandered off to find a quiet spot. I ended up on a little hill overlooking the water. I lit up, enjoying the stillness of the night. The moonlight reflected off the pond, making the whole scene look peaceful. But after a while, I started hearing this weird noise coming from the far side of the water. I squinted in that direction and thought I saw something moving. Keep in mind, I was pretty out of it and couldn't see clearly. After staring for a bit, I saw a figure step out from the shadows. My heart dropped. It was a tall guy, wearing a hood and dressed entirely in black. He had to be over 6.5 feet tall. Then I noticed he was holding a shovel. I froze in place as his gaze locked onto me. To my horror, he suddenly started sprinting around the pond straight toward me. Panicked, I bolted back to the cabin as fast as I could. He was ridiculously fast, but I had a shorter path to the cabins. I reached our driveway and ducked behind our car, trying to catch my breath. Peeking out, I saw him about 20 yards away, scanning the area for me. Thankfully, he turned and disappeared behind one of the other buildings. I seized the opportunity to sneak back inside, locking every door behind me. I climbed into bed, trying to convince myself it didn't happen. The rest of the trip went by without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory. What was he doing with that shovel? And why did he chase me so suddenly? Part of me thinks he was burying something, maybe even someone. I'll never know for sure, but one thing's certain. I never want to encounter that terrifying giant in the woods again. I've always enjoyed camping. There's something magical about leaving everything behind. No traffic, no gadgets, just the calm of nature. This time, I chose a spot near a remote hamlet in the US, far from any city. The area was serene, with rolling hills, dense forest, and hardly a soul around. It seemed like the perfect retreat. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my SUV on a dirt path, and hiked about a mile into the woods. I found a small clearing where I set up my tent and prepared a fire pit. The place was peaceful, almost eerily so, but I didn't dwell on it. I set up camp, gathered wood, and ate my dinner as the sun dipped below the horizon. When night fell, the forest became pitch black. My fire was the only light, and above, stars dotted the vast sky. I sat by the fire, soaking in the silence. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. After extinguishing the fire, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and settled in. I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep when I woke abruptly. Something felt off. At first, I thought it was just the wind. I could hear leaves rustling, and the trees swayed slightly. But then I caught it, a soft, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. My pulse quickened as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound didn't match either. I stayed motionless, straining to listen. Then, the steps stopped, and the forest fell into complete silence again. Just as I was beginning to calm down, I heard it, something brushing against the side of my tent. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like fingers trailing over the fabric. My stomach sank. I reached for the knife I always kept nearby when camping. Gripping it tightly, I debated what to do. Should I call out? Should I check outside? Before I could decide, the sound stopped. The silence was suffocating. I sat there, knife in hand, barely breathing. Hours seemed to crawl by, and eventually, sheer exhaustion must have overtaken me. When I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was filtering through the fabric of the tent. Cautiously, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, clutching my knife. Everything looked normal at first, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Barefoot, human. They weren't just near my tent. They circled it over and over. A cold dread filled me as I followed the tracks. They led off into the forest, disappearing among the trees. My chest tightened as panic set in. I hastily packed my belongings, shoving everything into my bag. The hike back to my SUV felt endless. The woods seemed darker than before, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally reached my vehicle, I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove toward the village, an uneasy feeling lingered. Near the village's edge, I spotted a small notice board with faded papers pinned to it. Something compelled me to stop. One poster immediately caught my attention. It was a missing persons notice. The photograph was faint, but the man's face was still discernible. The date on the flyer indicated he'd vanished about half a year ago, right in these woods. My heart raced as I stared at it. Then, I noticed the paper's edges were frayed, as though someone had been handling it repeatedly, pinning and unpinning it. I didn't wait to find out more. I drove out of the area and didn't stop until I was hours away. Even now, I can't make sense of what happened. The footprints, though, they haunt me. They were human, barefoot, and far too close to my tent. But what chills me the most is this. Whoever it was didn't just stumble upon me in the woods. They were watching, circling, perhaps all night long.